Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for being here at our Harlow seminar series. We're so glad to have you. We have some special guests here from Laramie today. So I would like to introduce you to the president of the University of Wyoming, Dr. Ed Seidel. Before he gives just a few words, we want to thank him here at the AMK community for all of the support that we have had from him. So we can carry on events like these, but also maintain these beautiful historic buildings and all the wonderful research that goes on up here at AMK. With that.
Thank you.
Yes.
Well, thanks. And so I'm Ed Seidel, president of the university, and this is one of the greatest privileges of this job, is being able to come up here and to be able to spend some time in this beautiful place that we call the AMK Ranch. And it is a place that we're investing a lot in over the years. We've had our trustees who are all fully behind this, have been taking funds from our reserves in order to help build out things like renovating this building. We have a fabulous relationship with Chip Jenkins and the Grand Teton National Park. Chip, I saw you somewhere, but you're in the back there. And we've met many times. I so appreciate this relationship and all that we can do together here. I was here for one of the many reasons we have this ranch or this place here. About 2 years ago, in particular, we had a beautiful meeting in this very room with Cardiff University. It's just one of the examples where we can bring in researchers and others from all around the world, and we can do things together that we couldn't do alone. And so we spent about 3 days here just brainstorming how we could work together. As an example, they have folks that come here now on a regular basis. They also have a research station in Borneo. And some of you will know John Kaprowski, the head of our HELP school, and John and others go also to the Borneo field station that they have. And collectively, we can just do a lot more. We can also just use this as a place that brings our students together and our faculty for the kind of research that they do. We have a significant grant from the National Science Foundation, but many other activities that are funded by multiple organizations that help us do this. And we have a lot of interest in continuing this work really for years and years to come. So I look forward to being here, in fact, for years and years to come, because it's so beautiful. I want to point out something else just behind us. I haven't actually seen it yet, but I want to go see it. There's a thing called a SAGE node, and I forget what SAGE stands for. Maybe you recall, but in any case, we have a collaboration with Argonne National Laboratory, and they have built these remote observing stations that have like a Starlink antenna, and they've got a solar panels, so they've got power, they have computing environments, and they have all kinds of sensors from microphones to 3D cameras, infrared, and everything in order to just observe what's here. And then they can do the computing on the edge with some AI techniques and so on. And then they can send back the results to Laramie, but it's part of a worldwide network, and anybody can add additional capabilities to this. So there's a very sophisticated set of scientific activities going on, and that's just a couple of the examples of it. So I think I won't say much more, although I'd love to. I do want to say a word about the Harlow lecture series. We're just very, very proud to host this lecture series. I'm so pleased to see so many people from the community being here, and I want to thank Hank Harlow for all that he's done in order to help our students, and this lecture series is in his name. So thanks a lot. I think I'll hand it back to you. Thanks for everything.
Once again, thank you. And without further ado, I would like to introduce Yvette Converse. She's here with us from Grand Teton National Park. She is the Chief of Science and Natural Resources with them and has a storied career here doing a variety of management. How's that?
So
yeah.
Testing.
Yeah.
Can you hear me in the back? Testing.
Okay, we'll give it a go. Anyways, I'll hand it over to Yvette.
Thanks so much. And I just want to, I had a knee surgery, a knee replacement about a month ago. So I'm limping around and putting on ice if you're wondering why. It's because I'm getting old. Um, So I'm just gonna stay here. Okay, let me get going here. There we go. So I'm just gonna start right into this because the first part of my presentation here is gonna sort of tell you about where I've been in my career and why that landed me here and the way I look at the landscape here in Grand Teton, which really helps me inform the science and the management and advising Chip and the park on how to handle natural resources. I'm going to talk a little bit about landscapes and change, and that's sort of what I've learned through my career. Drill down a little bit on the Grand Teton as a park, then how we manage natural resources in the park, or some examples of that, and then sort of thinking into the future.
Can we increase the volume a bit?
Increase? Did you say?
Increase.
Pull this up. Is that better?
Little bit.
Let's pull it up closer. Is that better? Okay. So I grew up in Pennsylvania, north central Pennsylvania, went to college there, didn't really do much traveling as a young person. And then my college roommate talked me into, let's go to the Tetons for the summer. She ended up bailing. I ended up coming out in 87 and spent 2 summers, 87 and 88, waitressing at Jackson Lake Lodge and landing directly in, Jackson Hole, coming from Pennsylvania. I was pretty awestruck, as I'm sure most of you have experienced, and knew that I loved the wide open spaces and was going to make the West my home. So I did. So my first experiences was looking at this landscape through, wow, look at these wide open spaces without acknowledging or understanding the role of public lands. 87 and 88, if we're here then, those were 2 really big fire years. This was new to me. I didn't really understand fire ecology or fire behavior. Of course, I think we're still learning about that. But it was sort of my first introduction to this kind of physical and ecological processes happening on the land and how we manage public lands. And it, in fact, inspired me so much that I spent a summer as a Logan hotshot or doing firefighting because I thought it was environmental work at the time. I learned quickly it was not. But then I ended up in Utah, read a book called Cadillac Desert, started exploring the Colorado Plateau and the Colorado River Basin and kind of fell in love with a different kind of landscape down there. And reading Cadillac Desert, if anyone read that book about the development of water and air reclamation in the Colorado River, it really kind of inspired me in a weird way to want to work in government and civil service and use science to make good decisions. So that's really was sort of where I was at that time. And I was able to land a really nice gig working in the Grand Canyon studying a native fish, the humpback chub. So I did that for a couple of years while I was getting my graduate degree in my master's degree in aquatic ecology and watershed science. So, coming out of my master's degree, I spent a few years working for the state of Utah as a fish biologist, and then eventually landed with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service doing endangered species work, basically, again, working with Colorado River fish and other endangered fish in Utah. So really exploring the state of Utah as a landscape, which is very different than up here. In 2004, I moved up to the Bozeman Fish Technology Center in Bozeman. It's a native fish research facility. I was the assistant director there for 5 years, and pallid sturgeon was one of our big focus species, along with others. And pallid sturgeon, as you know, probably know, is, I'm pressing the wrong button, I'll try to be careful about that, is in the Missouri River, native species, endangered species. And the Missouri is another very large and complex landscape. So now I'm looking at the Greater Yellowstone and the Tetons, I'm looking at Utah, and then I'm looking at the Missouri River, and I'm seeing some things in common. I'm seeing complex jurisdictions underlying these really difficult natural resource management issues, and a lot of conflicting resource values and goals among different factions and interest groups. That set me up really well to move into a job in 2009, where the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, with the support of the Department of Interior, started to think about large landscapes. And if you're following conservation, large landscape conservation has become a buzzword in the last 15 or so years. And so the government was kind of picking up that torch and kind of saying, hey, how can we help? And part of the reason for that is we've seen this unprecedented level of change across the surface of the earth. Across the globe, and we're trying to understand how is this affecting our natural resources into the future, and what can we do? And what we know we have to do is work across these boundaries, these jurisdictional boundaries, these physical boundaries. We have to share science. We can't do it in a compartmentalized way like we used to do when we had a lot more space and a lot less of this activity going on. So I spent about 8 years doing this work until the administration changed and some priorities shifted. Before I move on though, I will say one of the things about that job that I really loved was starting to understand how we apply science at the landscape scale. And of course, landscape science is kind of a misnomer because we really don't get science at that very large scale. We get information at that large scale. We look at the problems at that large scale, and then we try to drill down to at what scale is it important to take action, and how do we do that using science to inform that action. So this is just an example. Here we have the Yellowstone Park in purple, and we have the Bitterroot, the Central Idaho Wilderness area in green. And we might be thinking about grizzly bear population here, grizzly bear population here. We want these populations to be connected, and we want the areas between them to have some level of protection into the future so they can continue to be protected and connected. So we do some science to try to understand where are the bears, what kind of habitat are they using, how do they move across the landscape. And that sounds very simple. Now, okay, so let's go out and protect it. And then you look at the landscape, and it looks a little bit like this, right? So there's multiple jurisdictions, multiple landowners, even within the federal government, very complex. And then you add state, tribal, local, private, and it gets very difficult. So it's not an easy thing. So part of the effort of this large landscape effort was to kind of bring together under sort of a common context, what are we aiming for? What are we trying to achieve through these efforts? So when that position sort of shifted, or that program shifted, I went back to Utah and I became the project leader of the office that I started in down there. And it's a regulatory ESA office. So I was doing endangered species work in Utah until this job opened up. And I can tell you, I saw this job open up back in 2003. I was not at the time at the level where I could apply for this job. And I thought, wow, that looks like a fantastic job. And then it just happened to open up in 2022 and I applied, and unfortunately for me, I'm here. So came full circle back to the Tetons. And now I'm looking at this landscape in a different way after 30 years of being through different landscapes and different jobs and kind of thinking about these complex problems. And so I'm here as chief scientist. I'm here to advise CHIP and leadership onto what's the best way to protect our resources here in the park. What should we be thinking about as we do our work in the park? So let's orient ourselves to the Greater Yellowstone. Grand Teton is at the southern end of the Greater Yellowstone, kind of in the middle, really, if you include the forest lands around it. And most people think of Yellowstone Park as the core of Greater Yellowstone. And when you look at it from a continental perspective, you think, well, it's really not very developed. Most people consider it to be pretty pristine or intact ecologically. That's true. But when you look at the jurisdictional complexity underlaying that, national forests, multiple land agencies, BLM, the Park Service, the Fish and Wildlife Service, the refuge system. And then on top of that, the state lands, on top of that, the complexity of state government, tribal lands, in addition to that, and then private lands, of course, and county governments as well. So it's very complex, even though this might be relatively unimpacted ecosystem. Layer on top of that, the laws and governance. So each agency operates under different mandates, different missions, different direction and regulations and policy. And that trickles down through the different layers of government as well. States, tribes, they all have sort of their own versions. And then we have the federal regulations, the state regulations that apply to all of us. So it gets pretty complex. Also, another part of looking at where we are in Grand Teton is we're not just part of the Greater Yellowstone, we're in the headwaters of the Snake River. The Snake River, a tributary to the Columbia River, drains the northwest part of the United States. So we're seeing some complexity here to what we are as a park. We're more than just the middle of the Greater Yellowstone. I get my direction from the Park Service, and the mission of the Park Service is to preserve unimpaired the natural and cultural resources and values of the national parks system and national park lands for the enjoyment, the education, and the inspiration of this and future generations. So we take that very seriously. And when you look at that, oftentimes this is referred to as the dual mandate. We're trying to protect resources and we're trying to provide for visitors. As I read, we're trying to protect resources so that people can enjoy and be educated and be inspired. Without those resources, you don't have the second part of that. So to me, it's fundamentally very important to do that first part. But it does often put us in a place of having some conflicts when we have to also manage visitors that can potentially have impacts on our resources. We follow our guidance from our management policies. This is a 2006 management guidance. I took the entire document, put it into a word cloud, and the word that pops out as most prominent is resources. So that just substantiates that resources are fundamentally at the core of what we do in the Park Service. I'm sorry, that keeps happening. Okay, so I'm going to drill down a little bit on Grand Teton as a park. What dictates how each park operates is its enabling legislation. That's the legislation that's passed when the park is established. If you know the history of Grand Teton Park, you know that it was first established in 1929, and that was really a small portion. It was the mountain portion and the 6 lakes, Lee Lake, String Lake, Jenny Lake, Bradley, Taggart, and Phelps Lake. That was Grand Teton National Park in 1929. People in the valley at the time really wanted to protect this valley as well as the mountains and saw a lot of things happening they were concerned about with tourism and development and said, hey, you know, what can we do to get more protection? So there was the establishment of the Jackson Hole National Monument in 1943 that was most of the valley areas of the park at the time, with some substantial contributions from private donations like the Rockefellers. In 1950, it came together under what we kind of commonly call now the Grand Compromise. And the reason it was a compromise is because by that time, there had been a lot of people doing activities on this landscape. It was not necessarily a pristine environment, at least not the entire valley and the entire landscape. So there were some compromises built into that from the people that were doing things that didn't want to have to give those things up. So as a result, in our enabling legislation for Grand Teton National Park, we are we have to allow livestock grazing to those that have those rights. I will tell you that that has gone from what was 70,000 acres of open range grazing back when the park was established to what's now a few thousand acres of very controlled grazing of one cattle grazing operation, one other very small cattle grazing operation that will expire at some point, and then horse grazing in 2 small areas. So that has been much diminished over time, but it is part of our enabling legislation. So we are required by law to provide for those rights. It also provides for the elk hunts. People don't understand, why do we hunt elk in the park? This is part of what was considered at the time the management for the elk and the protection of the elk. And there'd been a long legacy of elk conservation here in the valley and other things that were included in that. And now I'm going to talk about this as a park of many different kinds of uses. So sometimes I sort of jokingly refer to it as a multi-use park. But that's because there's a lot of complex history to this valley and what the change is that has occurred. So, you know, if you think over the last 250 years, there's been substantial change in this valley. Oftentimes the public will come into the national parks and they envision these as areas that have not changed. They represent some kind of history that has not been changed or altered. But this has been a really dynamic landscape. We've had, you know, obviously indigenous people living here for millennia and wildlife that were here. Then explorers and during the trapping and exploring phase of the early 1800s, when homesteading started in the development of the West, ranching and agriculture became a dominant part of the work in the landscape here in Jackson Hole. And if you know anything about the Homesteading Act, part of getting your land, you had to prove up on it by doing agriculture, cultivation, irrigation and livestock. So that was part of what you had to do to get that land that you were claiming was yours. So it encouraged this, even in places like Jackson Hole, where it's probably not the best place to be farming or ranching. That said, as people recognize there may be a better way to make a living, let's go to dude ranching, and tourism became popular because of the beauty of the scenery and the wildlife. The industry and the commerce sort of shifted a little bit to dude ranching, tourism, recreation. Then you get into the early 1900s. We're talking about water management. We have a dam here in the park that predates the park by 50 years. That's Jackson Lake Dam that is managed by the Bureau of Reclamation. Then Grand Teton National Park was established, so an era of kind of protectionism and conservation. And modern wildlife management really didn't start until the 1900s. And most of you know the history of our elk population here and the Olaus Murray's role in that. And now we have in this era, this present era, I would say it's an era of exorbitant growth, exorbitant wealth, explosive growth, some climate change and other kinds of change that create sort of a lot of changes across the landscape, invasive species, including weeds, things like zebra mussels, chronic wasting disease, and then increasing visitation that we're trying to understand and stay in front of. At that same 200-year period, conservation biology was also evolving. So maybe 200, 300 years ago, coming out of the Age of Enlightenment, we started to think about conservation. Really, let's identify what species are out there, right? We're exploring new lands. Let's see what's out there. Animal collections, right? People started collecting animals. Then zoos became popular as a movement for conservation, right? So let's take these animals in, educate people, protect them, their genetics into the future. That's why we have the American Zoological Society. At some point, people said, well, maybe we can have these animals actually out in nature. So let's put them into large fenced-in areas called wildlife preserves. And Jackson Hole actually had a wildlife preserve established in 1947 near the Oxbow. You can kind of see remnants of that still. And at some point, then it went further and said, we don't need to fence these animals in. Let's reestablish these populations naturally and wild on the landscape. So natural reserves. Then the discussion sort of centered around, what do reserves need to look like? What's too small? How many do we need to have? Then do they need to be connected? What kind of open space designs do we need to put on those? More recently, we've started to talk about biodiversity and climate change with threats of different things happening across the world and loss of biodiversity. So these are all important, but I would say this is definitely a Euro-Anglo knowledge base. There's also a long history of indigenous people on the landscape that have a connection to the land and have worked in their culture in having a relationship with land as part of their culture. And that still goes on today. So we call that traditional ecological knowledge. What I'm most interested in sort of the ecological function and the resilience of these landscapes, because to me that, and looking forward at the spatially explicit ecological response to the change that we're seeing, is going to help us understand what to do into the future. Okay, so that's our first section of the discussion. And what I'm trying to say here that hopefully is resonating with you is that we live in a changing landscape here in the park and in the Greater Yellowstone. And it's a complex changing landscape. That change may be very slow when you look at the mountains with sort of geologic forces. And most of us think, wow, these things change very slowly over millennia. But actually, that change is not slow. You heard about the rockfall, right? Things happen catastrophically. They also happen seasonally. Precipitation really drives a lot of the features of our landscape. So that can be patterns of snowfall, rain, runoff throughout the year. Fire is an example of a catastrophic type of physical event that can shift the ecology drastically. And of course, floods like occurred in June of 2021 in Yellowstone that are also catastrophic. And more of these kinds of extreme events seem to be happening. And then, of course, we can't discount the change that occurs because of human development on the landscape as well. So what does this change look like in the park? From the standpoint of people, it means more visitors at different times of year than what we've been established and are operating to accommodate. New and changing recreation users, drones, right? e-bikes, all kinds of new ways to use the landscape that we have to figure out how to incorporate, or if we should incorporate, pressure to accommodate the ever-increasing visitors. From the standpoint of wildlife, what does that look like? Potentially migrations that are altered, life history disruptions, and I'll talk about some of these as we move forward here. Life history that is altered, that means parts of the history of the life cycle of the animals being altered, such as their movement patterns, their reproduction, being out of sync with seasons or invasive diseases. Also behavioral responsive wildlife, such as habituation. Water, these are, how does that change? How's that affected by all this change? It can be the demand from downstream water users. It can be how we use water on the landscape. Patterns of rain and snow throughout the year, aquatic habitats, including riparian and floodplains. And all of that water also can be a threat to our infrastructure that we've put a lot of time and effort and rely on to get around safely throughout the park. How does it affect habitat? We can see seasonal shifting in vegetation communities, say after a fire, something like that. And these transitions in communities being disrupted or being sped up. So, and the most common way to think about it is habitat fragmentation, right? So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of that. Again, back to this landscape. So how does this Grand Teton Park function as part of this larger landscape? This is a tool called the Human Modification Index that Dr. Dave Theobald established. You can find it on database and it's open for anyone to use. And really it's using human settlement, non-natural cover types and roads to kind of identify where we have large areas of change from what might have been natural on the landscape. I'm going to zoom in here on sort of this broader region of Yellowstone, and you can see there's not a lot of dark green. So I want to make sure you saw here, the scale goes from dark green up to more of a pink red color for higher levels of modification. So looking at the center here where it says historic range, you can see Yellowstone National Park. Not a lot of disruption, not a lot of human modification. We zoom on it a little more. Here's Yellowstone, roughly. What do you see there? What does that dark green human modification represent? Roads, right? And most of us who've been in Yellowstone understand if you walk 100 yards off the boardwalk or off the road, you're pretty much by yourself, right? So there's huge areas of wilderness and undisturbed lands in Yellowstone. Here's Grand Teton, roughly. It's not quite that shape, but and we have some of those areas that aren't impacted by densities of roads. Unfortunately, they're connected to large areas of the Greater Teton Wilderness and the Greater Yellowstone. That these areas become then sort of these reservoirs of biodiversity and intact ecological function that help to really feed into the rest of the park and the area lands around them. We also have parts of the park that look like this. And what do you see there? High road density. And when you translate road density into park management, particularly natural resource management, what we're talking about is conflicts with wildlife, habitat fragmentation, and management issues, right? Just building and maintaining roads, safety and other things like that. So when people say, well, we're like Yellowstone, we should do everything just like Yellowstone. We're a little different than Yellowstone. And you look at the size, right? We have that road density in a fraction of the size of Yellowstone. I'm going to talk a little bit too about sort of over time how the park maybe has changed. So you think sort of over millennia, say post-glacial era, wildlife occupying and migrating through seasonally probably through the parks, and indigenous people following those wildlife migrations up until about the mid-1800s. So we talked about that change. Then what happens with homesteading? We start to see homes, ranches. We start to see water development, agriculture, infrastructure to develop water, like dams in the 1900s. Also livestock, domestic livestock, like cows and horses. And the displacement of native people and the loss of a lot of wildlife as well, because they compete with those interests of that domesticating landscape. However, like we said, this is a difficult place to ranch and to make a living off the land. So inevitably, tourism became ultimately the thing that was going to keep us going here. So then we have development areas around tourism. And a lot of different, because of that tourism interest in wildlife, then we start to see the restoration of some of these migrations, some of these wildlife populations coming back, and we'll talk about that. In addition, now we have recreation popping onto the landscape in a lot of different ways, right? So what I'm trying to convey here is that it's very complex. And over here on the left side of the screen, you see these sort of natural resource areas and the sort of functional resilience of nature. And then the visitors coming in and experiencing that. And that overlays this complex management underneath with human activities like airports, inholdings of homes, dams, livestock. That's part of our park. So that's not a value judgment. That is just how it is. But what it does is add a lot of complexity to the way we manage the park, particularly for natural resources. Okay, that's part 2 of the discussion. I'm going to move into talking what we do in our natural resource programs. I'm only going to focus on the natural resource part of it. My program also covers cultural resources and social science, but I'm going to talk about physical sciences, vegetation ecology, and fish and wildlife. Simeon Kasky is our branch chief of physical sciences. He's a hydrologist. Physical sciences covers the abiotic stuff, right? Rocks, air, water. We have a big interest in the water here in the park because that is part of the lifeblood of our system here. So protecting water, protecting flows, protecting those water sources. That starts up at the top of the mountains with glaciers. There's 11 glaciers in the park. We do keep track of those on some level, a lot with university partners participating in some of that science with us. These are snow glaciers. We also have rock glaciers, which is kind of an emerging interest. Rock glaciers are subsurface, usually under talus, kind of a mix of slurry of rock and ice mixed together, but they create these sort of subterranean cold habitats that can be like a refugia ecologically, or they can be a refugia for cold water sources. So glaciers are very important. We have specific studies going on the Middle Teton Glacier that we keep track of those changes over time. We also are very much invested in the Snake River and how that's managed. As I mentioned earlier, the Snake River is the headwaters we're at the headwaters of the Snake River, and the Snake River feeds this large center of food productivity in south central Idaho. And that is, agricultural crops. It can also be livestock, but this water was developed initially in 1906 with the dam first being built. And that's why the water that is contained in our reservoir storage capacity, most of it, 96% of it, belongs to Idaho. So this is called the teacup diagram. This is Bureau of Reclamation's diagram and how they think about the upper Snake River system of reservoirs. You can see us. Here we are. This was in 2023, I believe. We went into the season with sort of a deficit, like a lot of reservoir capacity still there. And what happened that year, usually when they're building these systems, they're thinking about the water filling up from the top of the system and then going down. So you have a full system by the time you need it later in the season. But what happened in this year was that the bottom filled up first because they had a very wet season and we still had space. And that resulted in the folks down here being asked to spill that water so they didn't threaten their infrastructure and their dams, meaning let that water go, pass down the river. To a lot of us in ecology, that's a good thing. To water users, that's not a good thing. That's considered wasted water. So as a result, they asked Bureau of Reclamation, we need to keep some storage, we need to fill up that capacity that's available upstream. Turn off the dam. So if you were around in town a couple of years ago when that happened, that's why that happened, okay? When you look at a hydrograph, so this is water coming downstream throughout the year at a single point. So usually the water year is October to October. So starting in October, and then in usually low flows through the winter in this kind of snow melt fed hydrology, getting into spring, usually April, May, in these kinds of climates. You see the peaks where the snow melts, runs off, you get high peaks, and then the water drops off later in the summer. So this is kind of an example of a natural hydrograph in blue for the Snake River. In fact, I believe this is data taken on average hydrograph for above the lake. And those high flows, those peaks, they function to maintain habitat, and they function to maintain the channel, right? They move sediment downstream, and it keeps that channel functioning in the way that it should. When we put in a dam, then what we want to do is redistribute that water in a different way, usually because we need to have it, in this case, downstream at a later time of year. So we store it, we take the water off of the top of the hydrograph, this gets stored, and then it gets sent down later in the year, right? What's important to understand about this, and particularly for Jackson Lake as a reservoir, it's a pretty small reservoir, about 40 feet up high is the dam. The storage capacity is relatively small, meaning it can't store even a full year's worth of water. You couldn't store the full year's worth of water coming down. That means you have to store it and use it in the same year in a different way, right? If you're going to redistribute it, compared to, say, Lake Powell, that can store 4 years worth of water. So you could take all the water for 4 years. We don't have that kind of system. So water that you want to add in one part of the year has to come off at another part of the year. So it becomes a challenge. One of the positives here from the standpoint of recreation is we have these late summer high flows that keeps people boating and fishing late into September, even October. If this was natural flow on the Snake below the dam, we probably wouldn't be able to boat at that time of year. Okay. When you put in a dam, it disrupts the sediment distribution downstream. You can see this map over here of the Snake River. At one point, it has an equilibrium where it's sort of established the way it's moving those channel forming flows from those big peaks. You put in a dam, it changes the sediment, it changes the flow, and it disturbs the equilibrium, and those channels start shifting and changing. These channels are always shifting and changing, so that's not necessarily bad, but it is a disequilibrium. So our river is still adjusting to the dam and the changes there. On top of it, most of the river is pretty dynamic. Most of the river system in the Snake River is pretty dynamic. We have a lot of tributaries, Pacific Creek, Buffalo Fork, Gros Ventre, that add substantial flows in. And so there is a wild nature to our system. It's not fully regulated like, say, the Colorado below Lake Powell. So that means we have things like large catastrophic flood events. This is on the Gros Ventre on the left, where the Gros Ventre River was threatening infrastructure. On the right is the Snake River near Moran Junction. And what you want to notice there is that back in 1975, the river channel was on the west side of the floodplain. And over a period of 40, 50 years, it migrated over to the east side of the floodplain. That's a natural thing. However, the road is on the east side of the floodplain. So now we have to try to understand, is that a threat to our infrastructure? A major thoroughfare and state highway going through there, should we consider redesigning that? And how do we do that in a way that allows this river to maintain its natural function, which is important for that floodplain connectivity? Okay, moving into vegetation ecology and management. This is really about habitat. We have some priorities in our vegetation program, which is protecting sagebrush. That's a lot of the valley areas. We have something like 70,000 acres of sagebrush. Also resilient forests. And by resilient, it means able to bounce back from, things that happen that are impactful. So able to survive and bounce back. We also focus on rangeland health because we do have grazing in the park. We also have a program for native plant materials. And what that really means is seed collection. And I'll talk a little bit about that. Seed collection and raising a nursery and raising plants for restoration activities. Okay, so this is what we mean by restoration here. The picture on the left is taken from the north part of Blacktail Butte, looking out towards Moore Monroe. You can see the intersection of Moore Monroe right up here. So this is all cultivation that had been happening for 50 to 70 years. I don't know the exact date of this photo, but what we're trying to do is restore that, take out those pasture grasses, which are very homogeneous, not as nutritious, and restore back the native vegetation. You've probably come to some lectures here about that. But it's not a simple process. It's not as easy as going out and digging up the forage, the pasture grass, and going down to Ace Hardware and buying a bag of native sagebrush seed mix. So we collect our seeds. We have to manage those seeds, and we keep them into the future. We do science to determine the best seed mix of forbs and grasses and sagebrush and other kinds of brush that's in there. And that's all part of sort of the science that goes into understanding how does this best work. We also test how to do those treatments. We might do digging them up with tractors. We might do fire treatments. We might do chemical treatments, trying to understand what works best in the long run. And of course, you guys know when you dig up your yard and you want to transplant it, if you leave it barren, what happens? Do you get native vegetation? You get weeds, right? So there's a lot of effort that has to go into keeping those weeds down while the native vegetation, which is much more slowly growing, comes in until that becomes established. And if you think this is sort of us doing this in a vacuum, it's not. Throughout the West, this is the Western US, there's a great effort going on among 11 or 12 states to protect the sagebrush biome. This dark blue is what's considered core, extant, healthy sagebrush throughout the West. The light blue are areas that are maybe more impacted, but have opportunity to be restored, like some of what we're looking at here. We also have some core areas. And then the orange here is either other vegetation types or other rangelands, or probably cheatgrass too. Here we are on this, and you think, well, it's such a small part. I mean, we probably have, like I said, 70,000 acres of sagebrush habitat here. So this is a huge biome that goes up into Canada, down even into Mexico. And we want to protect it because there's a lot of native biodiversity along with that, not just greater sage-grouse, but red-tailed hawks, coyote, mule deer. We see elk, moose, bison out there using our sagebrush habitat. And I just want to point out here, part of the importance of having these little islands amongst this biome is so that we can, that's that resilience, right? One area blinks out, another area has the species that can then recolonize and fill that in. So that's what that's about. So we're part of a bigger landscape effort to protect that sagebrush. Whitebark pine, conservation and restoration. This is a 5-needle pine, grows at high elevations. Became ESA listed as threatened in just a couple years ago. So we have been working on it for 20 some years, but we are now working on it actively as a listed species to try to recover that species or at least maintain it in the parks, along with working with our partners. So the threats to whitebark pine are multiple. There's a native mountain pine beetle, but because of changes in climate that allow for warmer winters, which usually knock back the pine beetle, that's not happening, and we're having bigger infestations, which is creating more beetle kill. In addition to that, there's a non-native blister rust that the two combined can really devastate a stand of trees. So we do things like collect cones from trees that appear to be resistant to that blister rust. We also set out verbenone patches, which is a hormone patch to try to deter the beetles from coming in and infesting our most important trees. We work, like I said, across this landscape with our Forest Service, BLM, state, and other partners to try to share information and do this in a way that's going to make sense for the species in the long run. So there's a U.S. Forest Service tree nursery that we work with to do grow out, and then we directly plant, and then we sort of do science to determine, is planting small trees more effective than planting seeds? Where do you get the most bang for your buck? And doing different treatments in different parts of the landscape to understand where you're going to get the most effectiveness from that investment in restoration. So that's part of the science that goes into our whitebark pine conservation plan. Northern Rockies Conservation Cooperative, Peyton is here, Susan Clark is here, American Forest, as I mentioned, BLM, Forest Service, and Park Service, and Fish and Wildlife Service, all involved in this work. I'm going to quickly show, oops. I'm not sure if this is going to work. Let's see. Casey, are you here? Okay, that's okay if it doesn't work. I was going to show a little video that kind of shows some of our whitebark pine. Okay, I'm moving on to wildlife. Chip, I've heard Chip say this numerous times, and you probably know it yourselves from your experience, that we learned from some of our social science that 85% of visitors that come here to have an experience to view wildlife. Right? So mainly these big iconic species that no longer are able to occur in other places, right? This is some of their refugia. There are elk and moose and bison in other places, but we have sort of a natural environment for them. We also have a lot of small mammals, right? You know about those. Some of them invade our homes. We do a lot to protect and understand the ecology of birds of prey, water birds, and songbirds in the park. So a big avian ecology program. And then there's a lot of work on just understanding the smaller species, or the lesser species, I would say, smaller species that really comprise the bulk of the biodiversity. Most of this kind of work is done by our partners, especially the universities, University of Wyoming students, work that gets done here at AMK. If you look at the board in the alcove over there, you can see a lot of work on butterflies and other things like that to understand the importance of some of these species to our biodiversity. Okay, talking about bears. Most of you know the story. Bears were down to a very small number, isolated in Yellowstone, probably about a couple hundred in the mid-70s. They became a listed species in the mid-70s, and we started to protect them. And basically, we started to not kill them and allowed them to move freely across the landscape. So we started building tolerance into our society. As you'll hear Kate Wilmot, our Fish and Wildlife, and Justin Swabitis, and a bear biologist say, managing bears is really managing people to tolerate bears. So now we have a population of over 1,000 bears in this ecosystem. It's considered fully biologically recovered, meaning the species has saturated the parts of the ecosystem we expect it to fully occupy. Beyond that, there's areas where bears potentially could move into, but we don't likely have the kind of habitat or tolerance for them to persist. So this is where it's happening. And when you look at the Greater Yellowstone, up at the top is the Northern Continental Divide population of grizzly bear. You can see in yellow, these are the recovery units associated with grizzly bear recovery. So the Cabinet Yaak and the Bitterroot, which is not occupied. If Cascades was on here, you'd see yellow around that as well, not occupied at this time. But what we're trying to do is get these remaining areas where we can tolerate grizzly bears to be connected so that population can persist into the future. Right now, between the Northern Continental Divide population and the Greater Yellowstone, it's about 60 miles. And then occasionally bears do move out. They have modeled sort of what they think bears might use in this area between this south part of the Continental Divide and the north part of the Greater Yellowstone. Sometimes the bears show up in central Montana. They don't always follow the rules. But this is how we do our work at a landscape scale. Let's see if this one works. Does everybody know who this is? This is Bear 399 with her quadruplets from 2020. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this video, but just to emphasize the point that we all love seeing bears on the landscape. They're beautiful animals. They're just incredible to watch, intimidating, and cute, right? That kind of notoriety that happened during COVID with the levels of visitation that we were getting at the time created this phenomenon of our celebrity bear 399, who has her own Instagram page, her own Wikipedia page, 30,000 followers on Instagram. It also has notoriety associated with that. You probably can't hear this, but this was a news report. The date at the top is November 2021. So this is when her bears were now in their second year, because grizzly bears stay usually with their parents for 2 years. And this is in downtown Jackson, actually in the police station. So you worry when you're out hiking about running into one bear. Imagine running into 5 bears. And the point here is that we love bears, but at the same time, for them to persist and survive as wild creatures on this landscape, We have to do our best to work together to keep those bears wild and not accommodating them in human environments. And that's a really hard thing for people to see because we have to force them out of human environments. This is the dumpster that's near my house in the park. That's black bear print, but you can see they go around and explore these places because they're hungry. They're surviving. These animals aren't just playing out there. They're surviving. So this is 399 in her final litter. I think everyone knows she was hit by a car last fall at 28 years old. So she has a long legacy of genetics now spread out in bears across the landscape. Wolves, we also have wolves on the landscape. Another conservation success story. What does this mean at a landscape scale? Some of you have probably seen the video about how wolves have impacted the Yellowstone ecosystem. There's still a lot of science and debate about that, but I've seen it myself. When I came here in '87, you would see masses of, thousands of elk all sitting down in a big pasture, not worrying about a thing. You don't see that much anymore. They're kind of dispersed and they're hiding out. The elk are still there, but they're not behaving the same way. And that change in behavior, I think you used to see the Lamar Valley kind of mowed down all along its banks. Now you see willow coming back because the elk aren't concentrated in those riparian areas. Same way cows might concentrate around a creek. So at any given time, we might have anywhere from 2 to 5 packs of wolves using parts of Grand Teton. We're not big enough as a park to have any one pack solely use our park. So they're always moving around outside and overlapping their territories. And we do follow that as part of a larger wolf management strategy with the state, and to understand how wolves are using the landscape, how that use is affecting other species like coyote and foxes. This is a University of Wyoming project that probably is on the lecture series somewhere, Joe Holber, that we do in cooperation with them, to understand how the interactions between these animals. So some people believe we have more foxes today and less coyote because of wolves. And that's part of what we're trying to understand. And of course, that kind of predator behavior on the landscape affects ungulates, right? Because they're going to behave different, like we talked about, potentially. This is from Arthur Middleton's work, mapping migration corridors of elk in the Greater Yellowstone. To me, this looks like, kind of a neural network, but really I like to describe it as an energy network. This is biomass and energy moving across the landscape as these elk travel up to higher ground in the winter, in the summer to reach that nutritious new growth. And then they move down in the winter to get that winter forage. That's moving their biomass and their basically energy across the landscape. Same with mule deer. Again, this is a lot of work we do here in the park, but we do it in partnership with our other federal agency partners, as well as the state partners and the university partners. The Wyoming Migration Initiative next week, Gregory Nicholson is going to be here to talk about Deer 255, I believe, and I will be here because she is my favorite mule deer. And it's just incredible. What I want to share is this video, because this is, to me, one of the most impactful pieces of science communication. And hopefully you can see why. So it's only 2 minutes. Has anyone seen this before? That's Matt Kaufman. He's with the USGS Co-op Unit at University of Wyoming this is his part of his program. So this is kind of her normal migration route. In 2019, she spent the summer near Moran. And you have to understand, technology in the last 20 years has changed so that we can get this kind of information. 30 years ago, we couldn't get this kind of information. We had to do wildlife overflights, and you'd find out where it was at a point in time and try to figure out where they were moving between those. Now we can actually watch that animal move across the landscape in real time. You wonder what those wildlife management areas are about? This animal's going through one. That's strategic conservation. You wonder what we mean by conservation easements and the importance of those? There's scientists and managers on the landscape trying to figure out where those key pieces of land are that need to be protected because of this kind of science. This animal goes down almost to I-80 to spend the winter. So she actually died last year. There's a great article in High Country News about it, and some other media reported it as well. She was killed by a mountain lion on her winter range. They found her collar, and the evidence on the carcass demonstrated that she was killed by a mountain lion. Great way to go at 11 years, which is pretty old for a mule deer. Incredible wealth of information from this animal that we've learned. This is the path of the pronghorn, sublet herd of pronghorn. Again, another long, really incredible migration story of pronghorn. And what I'm going to share here is the role we play as a park in this. First of all, we have science about how pronghorn are using the park. What we have to see is this, where this migration lets out in the summer into the Grand Teton, right? So you're right at that bottleneck of the migration corridor. And then it spills out into the park and they disperse and they use all that summer forage, again, surviving so that they can survive the next winter. They're not just out there playing, they're surviving. Every calorie, every time they're disturbed, every time we make them run, that's calories lost to them that can affect them in their overwinter survival the next year. This kind of science contributed to us being able to, us as a park, being able to acquire the Kelly parcel. Those of you who live here understand that was a multiple year effort that our superintendent was a huge part of making happen, as well as Jeremy Barnum, our previous chief of staff, our Grand Teton National Park Foundation, putting up and getting support from our philanthropists in the community and the Department of Interior Land and Water Conservation Fund, a result of a $100 million purchase of a state parcel of land. But you can see why that's so important. If there were houses or development in that spot, what that could mean for that migration. And when I mean survive in the summer, so that survive in the summer so they can survive the winter, that's a real thing. This was in the paper a few years ago, my first spring here. They had a really hard winter. It was a long, cold winter, so there was no melting of snowpacks between storms. The deer and pronghorn couldn't get through that snowpack down to the forage, and there was massive die-offs. This is a natural event. Like, these kinds of things happen in hard years. But what's not natural is when these animals are isolated and can't then bounce back. That's resilience. The fact that they have good summer range, the fact that there are other populations that can help recolonize, that's resilience. That's what we're looking for. I'm going to talk a little bit about bighorn sheep. Bighorn sheep, again, another migration story. We have Teton bighorn sheep. This is a native genetic herd that lives at highest peaks in the Tetons. Historically, they would have migrated down into, say, the valley areas, to the south primarily, maybe the buttes in town, maybe off to the west, over towards Driggs, displaced by sheep herding probably early on, displaced by human development. Now, what's left of that population, the ones that migrated no longer exist, and what we have are the ones that didn't migrate, which was a small part of the population, and they live year-round at the highest peaks. So in the middle of January, up at static peak. And we know that in part because we have some genetics information. So this is genetics, not demographic information. And what we see here is, this is the three herds on the east side of the valley, the National Elk Refuge, the Gros Ventre, and the Hoback herds are genetically mixing. That means they're moving, right? That means they're moving around, they're migrating, they're dispersing to new places. Our herd, this is the north, this is the south, not moving, right? They stay where they're at. So now we have this small, isolated, vulnerable population that makes it that much harder to conserve. On top of it, non-native mountain goats, beautiful animals, introduced by Idaho into the Snake River range to the south. A lot of times in species that you introduce will have sort of a period of explosive growth and then they start moving outward. We've seen goats move into the Tetons. They bring pneumonia. They also compete for forage in these environments that are very fragile. So we have an active program of removing those. It's not a fun thing. It's not something we like to do, but we know it's our best bet at protecting that bighorn sheep population for now. So we're trying it. We did an initial removal of about 90 animals. Since then, we've been able to keep the number very low and just do more micro removal when we need it. I'm not going to show you this video because it's long, but I would encourage you to watch it. You can find it if you just look up Denizens of Steep. You can also go to the Bighorn Sheep Working Group or look up Teton Bighorn Sheep. It's a great video about how we can do community stewardship here with the backcountry ski community to protect our bighorn sheep. I do have one clip from that video here, just one picture. And what this is sheep data from collared sheep and ski data from collared skiers carrying GPS units. This is not a causal relationship. We can't say these sheep are here because these skiers are here. That's not what this data is about. But what it does show you is how dangerously close we're coming to pushing those sheep further. Sheep, it's scientifically shown through data on bighorn sheep across the country, across the range, that they are disturbed by bipeds, people, whether that's an evolutionary response to hunting, whatever that is, at 300 yards approximately, they get up and they move. Is that a problem? Maybe not, except that these sheep are trying to survive a winter. And the way they survive is by finding these very small niches up in the high mountains where wind blows off the snow and they can find some grass to eat. And they have to carry their pregnancies through the winter in order to reproduce. That's why it's so important that we don't have higher levels of disturbance from humans in the high country during the winter. I'm not going to talk a lot about bison. We have a bison population here. It's year round. This probably wasn't how it was historically, but honestly, bison have been a landscape sort of keystone species for 10,000 years. And they change and they respond and they've co-evolved with people. There's a wonderful book called Wild New World by Dan Flores, if you haven't read it, but it talks about how the bison we have today are a result of 10,000 years of hunting pressure, right? Our bison population here mainly goes down to the refuge in the winter. They come up to about Elk Ranch, somewhere in that area, or the potholes in the summer, in the Snake River Valley. And this is a herd that was reintroduced because they had been extirpated in the late 1800s because there was cattle and livestock, and we didn't want bison competing with those or bringing in diseases, although the bison diseases came from cattle. But so we reintroduced them as part of that nature preserve that I showed a picture of. They came from Yellowstone originally. At some point, they came up with brucellosis because they would interact with cattle when they break out of the pen and we'd gather them up as a part and bring them back. So they are brucellosis positive, which means they're not going to be used for translocation in any way. And then on top of that, they are a little bit intermixed with cattle, but it's still considered a wild herd, even though they're fed on one end at the refuge and they're hunted on the other end through a hunting program with the state of Wyoming. So we work cooperatively on our wildlife management with the state. This is different than Yellowstone as well. Yellowstone was a park before Wyoming was a state. They have primacy over their resources. Here, we didn't become a park until Wyoming was well established for 70 or so years. And so we share and sort of co-steward many of these resources. So this kind of just shows in this picture how bison populations have moved in response probably to people and humans and that pressure. And the area of Yellowstone, which is now sort of the central of the most pristine or genetically pristine wild population of bison that represents our historic bison populations, probably weren't in Yellowstone historically, right? Okay, so what's our collective vision for Grand Teton and how do we protect those natural resources? The things that I'm thinking about are what are the conditions into the future and the trends that we have to look out for? Like, as Wayne Gretzky says, you want to go to where the puck is going to be, not to where it's at. Ecologically, we want ecological functionality in this system because it doesn't matter which species you're managing for. If you don't have a functioning system ecologically, it's not going to work. That functionality consists of things like connectivity, biodiversity, reservoirs or hotspots. So connectivity might be corridors, migrations, ability of animals to move across the landscape freely. Biodiversity hotspots, meaning areas that are relatively intact, like we pointed out up in the thoroughfare, the Bridge of Teton. wilderness. We also want these animals to be wild, and this is really important in bear management, because people want to view bears, they want to take pictures of bears. I understand that. We all love that. But the more bears get used to people, the less wild they are, the more they are in danger as individuals, the harder it is to maintain that population into the future. So when we try to move bears out of developed areas, that's to protect the bears and also to protect people. Because when the bears and people interact, it's the bear who's going to be paying the price in the long run. Native vegetation communities. Some of the work at University of Wyoming by Kevin Montes has shown the nutritional value of this native vegetation communities over some of this kind of like pasture grasses and other kinds of vegetation. Also looking at whether these core populations, dispersal, what kind of habitat it supports those functions. And then of course, clean and functional waters. One of the ways we're trying to move into our future here at Grand Teton is using our data to look at things in a spatial context from the standpoint of that ecological functionality. So black dots are elk collar data. What does it mean? Who knows, right? Elk at any given time was in this spot. But when you translate that and do the analysis and turn it into they're there at certain seasons, certain times of day, certain places, under certain circumstances, related to certain habitats, then you start to understand those relationships. And we can do this with multiple data sets in hopes to create this sort of resource atlas that can then inform the park on where we should and shouldn't be sort of pushing development and pushing more higher use or less use. So this is just some examples of how that kind of analysis might be done. These are larger landscape. I've used these in my talk, but you can see this is the way that might look. So again, going back to what is our role here? We want to preserve these natural and cultural resources, but it's not the resources, it's the functional system that supports those resources that we really need to protect in order to allow for that enjoyment, that education, and that inspiration to happen by our visitors and our residents. So we've all experienced this. This is a great experience. Out there at Oxbow Bend, getting the sunrise, lots of people. Hopefully you get to experience this as well sometime. Jenny Lake is incredible. People go by droves to get to Hidden Falls and Inspiration Point for the beauty in that experience, to be inspired, inspiration. Hopefully you get to experience this part of Jenny Lake as well. Viewing bears on the roadside. I ran into a visitor just early, probably it was April. The bears were first started coming out late April, early May. And she said, we just got here. And it was right by the road. She was so excited. We just got here and we're feeding a bear. That's a great way to help people understand the importance of these predators on the landscape for people that have no exposure to this. Hopefully you also get to see and experience this. The bear being a wild animal out in the wild, doing what it should be doing. Keeping that animal wary of people and afraid of being around people, wanting to live the life of the wild animal. So ultimately, in closing, Grand Teton is your park. I'm just a civil servant. And it really takes community stewardship. I'm going to be here and gone. Chip's going to be here and gone. People before us, people after us. Some of you live in the community. Some of you live outside the community, but this is still your park. You're here in this country, this is your park. So that takes being involved, being engaged, providing your input into our processes and decisions that we make. Because that legacy of conservation is more important to you as somebody living in the community, as somebody who's going to come back year to year with your children or your grandchildren, than it is to me as a civil servant. Everything I'm doing is to respond to that need that I'm hearing from you. Collaboration and engagement, the best way to do this, not regulations. I was a regulator. There's good things about regulation. It's a low bar. That's not how we try to get to where we want to go. And then understanding our shared values. To me, that's what's really important. At the end of the day, no matter how polarized we are as a society, we share some values in common and trying to understand. That's all I have.